Good evening, everyone. I'm David Suddjian, and welcome to Bird Bombs, helpful bursts of ID info. This is episode 20. It's probably a red tail. Everywhere, a large brown hawk may be seen, circling with motionless wings high above the earth, or perched upright in some solitary tree above a ditch or stream. If one watches closely the wheeling figure, when the light strikes it at the right angle, the whole broadly rounded tail shows dun red or cow color, in contrast to the brown wings and back. When a bird is perched and faces the observer, the head and throat show dusky brown. The breast is generally light colored, and the belly apparently crossed by a broad, dark band. The red-tailed hawk is a basic bird, right? We have the house finch, the mallard, the robin, the chickadee, the mourning dove, the seagull, and we have the red-tailed hawk. This is a basic bird. This is a bird that we probably know in some sense even before we become a birder, or certainly when we become one, it's a bird that we encounter early on. And it becomes very familiar to us early on. We even give it its own initial nickname like RT or RTH. And we become very familiar with what they look like. And we even expect to see them. And in fact, we start to look for other things that aren't them because we're familiar with them, right? But then soon as we stick with the birding thing, we realize that there's a complexity here. We're familiar, but there's different ages. We're hearing about different subspecies, and there's these different color morphs even. And then we find out that there's other kinds of bootios, other kinds of hawks, and they also have different ages and different color morphs maybe. It gets very complex. And then we're out in the field, and gosh, these birds are often far away or up high in the sky, a little dot, or they fly off and we don't see them very well. So there's a lot of challenges involved with the red-tailed hawk. And yet, here's the scenario. You're in a birding group, maybe it's three cars out on county road somewhere out in the backcountry, and you're coming up, lead car, you have radios, lead car says, we have a hawk coming up 5 poles ahead. That's probably a red tail. You get a little closer. Oh, wait a minute. Wait, actually, it might be something better. Isn't that sometimes how it goes? Better than a red tail. But here's what I would recommend. If you want to be a varsity birder, and your group spots a hawk that's off in the distance, be the very first one to say it's probably a red tail, and say it kind of like that. You know, kind of like you're kind of sure, but having the word probably in there kind of hedges your bet and shows that you realize that there's some complexity here. And the good thing is you're very probably going to be right. So it will be a red-tailed hawk. That's certainly the case here in the Denver metro region and along the Front Range and over much of Colorado. And most often it is a red-tailed hawk. So the red-tailed hawk is the most important raptor for Colorado birders to know well. And tonight we're going to go in this bird bombs, kind of figure out why that is and what's important to know about the red tail. What should you look for? Okay, so it's kind of a basic sort of situation. And most of this is the most widely seen raptor in Colorado. And it's also one of the most numerous in Colorado. And red tails use all terrestrial habitats essentially, from forest to the prairie and from really the highest mountain terrain down into the lowest country that Colorado has to offer. And they live in urban and developed areas and nest near people. So we see red tails in more places, and really we see more of them than other raptors. So this becomes an important reference species for us. In fact, those other basic birds I mentioned are also key reference species, really. The house finch, the mourning dove, the robin, and the mallard, because they are common and we have many opportunities to observe them and appreciate the details and the variety. All right, so these are ones that we can learn well, and they'll help us to recognize the other things that are closely related or similar. So these are good basic building blocks of reference species, and the red-tailed hawk is certainly one of those. So when you want to ask yourself, at least interiorly, if not out loud, sometimes when you're by yourself, is why isn't this a red tail? And sometimes that's happening like really fast in your thought process. But whenever you're looking at a hawk and you have some uncertainty, you want to ask yourself, why isn't it a red tail? And that should be the basic question that's behind your thought process kind of all along, is why isn't it a red tail? So red tails are Boodio hawks, but let's backtrack a little bit. They're in the family Accipitridae, and these is a broad family, including a lot of different types of diurnal raptors, from eagles to harriers and kites and hawks and accipiters. So lots of different varieties. Red-tailed hawk, Boodio jamecensis, and so it's named after Jamaica, where the first one was collected. And Bootios are kind of medium to large soaring hawks. So we got eagles on the far upper end of the spectrum and little small accipiters down on the small end of the spectrum in this family. Bootios are medium to large soaring hawks. And that means that they soar on thermals as one of their main things to do, right? So we see them circling up in the air regularly. They have these long, broad wings to help them in that effort, as well as these short, broad tails. We notice that the bodies are kind of stout, and they're kind of a hefty, bird as far as raptors can go. They're not as slender as some smaller birds we can think of in this group. Think of like a sharp-shinned hawk, for example. And they tend to favor open country. They may be in treed environments, and there are some species that actually favor treed settings, but a lot of them favor open country, and some of them it's very wide open indeed. Now, all of our Bootios are migratory, and some occur in Colorado only at certain seasons. If you want to see a Swainson's hawk, it's essentially April to October. If you want to see a rough-legged hawk, it's late October through March. Those are the only times you find those species, but the red-tailed hawk is present all year round. Now, some of the red-tailed individuals in Colorado are migratory and come to us during the wintertime or pass through during the southward migration and again in the spring. In fact, we have a hawk watch, and this photo down in the lower left is from our local Dinosaur Ridge Hawk Watch, which DFO staffs and sponsors. Great effort that happens in the springtime. So we have both migratory and resident red tails, those that are here with us all year round, probably on or near their home territories all year round through the winter as well. So when we're talking about Bootios, these the males and females generally are very similar in appearance. Some species that's not the case, but in the red tail they're very similar. The females are a little bit bigger, and that could translate into maybe 2 or 3 inches longer wingspan, for example. For the female red-tailed hawk versus the male red-tailed hawk. Now, the adult and the immature Bootios look different. Now, they're similar, but there's some differences in coloration and sometimes in markings. So while the males and females are alike, the adults and the young birds can look different. So let's get down to basics here. We have 5 key marks with the red-tailed hawk. And I want to point out that tonight we're focusing on pretty much the light morph, and I'll explain that a little later, but the light morph of the common western form of the red-tailed hawk. So just as you see pictured in these images right here, this is our basic red tail that we see in the Denver metro region and all along the Front Range in Colorado and over the western 2/3 of the state. Out in the prairie region, things become a little more varied, but this is what we're going to focus on tonight, is this light morph western form. And the very first basic key field mark, of course, is the red tail. But it's not red, it's orange. And let's take a little more closer look at the tail here. So this is a feature of adult red-tailed hawks. So the bird that is a juvenile bird does not have an orange tail. And in its second year of life, the tail may be more orange, but not as orange, and some other features, but we'll get to that. So it is orange, and there are some other details. You'll notice that it has this beautiful quality of kind of glowing when it's backlit and the tail is widespread. It looks very orange under that condition. So let's keep that in mind, especially when it's backlit. And then it has some black bars towards the tip of the feather that form a line across the tail, not at the tip of the tail, but a little bit in, and that's called a subterminal bar. Okay, so terminal would be at the end, and indeed those white tips form a white terminal bar on the tail, or a white terminal band. And the narrow dark markings form a subterminal band. Okay, we'll call it a band instead of a bar. All right, so here's another little detail. You can see on this bird that there's little bars all across all the tail feathers, and I think this is probably a 2-year-old bird, but some of them are more barred across the feathers than others. A lot of red tails will have some barring on the outermost feathers. I'm talking about all of these fine bars that are up in the orange part of the tail. So it's not just orange. There's stuff going on there, right? But look, this tail looks white underneath. Well, this is an orange tail too, but the nature of the lighting and the fact that the tail's a little bit closed, and we're looking at the underside makes it look whitish. You can see here on this more closed tail that when the feathers are more than one layer deep, they don't show orange because the light is being blocked by the layering of feathers. So you can still see the orange on the outermost rectrices or tail feathers here. And you can see how they all have a little bit of fine barring, but they all, and a darker subterminal bar and a white subterminal band and a white terminal band. Right, so the orange tail is actually a little complicated. What about the orange tail on this bird? Well, wait a minute, it just looks dark tailed, but no, it's not dark-tailed. So what you see showing all dark in the tail area of this bird are its wingtips. Now, the wingtips of the red-tailed hawk, when the bird is perched and the wings are folded, they overlie the tail and they hide most of it. If the lighting's not good or you don't look carefully, you may see a lot of wingtip and not much tail. But look, you can see orange peeking out. Maybe this guy will help us out. There we go. We can see it is indeed an orange tail with that dark subterminal band and pale terminal band there as well. Thank you very much, Mr. Red-tailed Hawk. So our second mark is the dark patagials. Now, we had to throw in a technical term, so I put in patagials here. I could have gone with the marginal lesser underwing coverts, but that's such a mouthful. So let's go with patagials, and it makes you sound intelligent. Again, you want to be a varsity birder. You don't say that dark area on the front part of the wing, you say patagials. Then you say it in a way, you pronounce it in a certain way that makes you sound a little bit annoying. No, but seriously, wow, look at those marginal lesser underwing coverts on that hawk. You know, it doesn't roll off quite as well. So the patagials are this feather tract in between the body of the bird and the bend of the wing or the wrist, and they at the leading edge on the underside. And on a red-tailed hawk, they tend to be very dark and contrasty on our typical light red-tailed hawks. So it's that dark bars, the dark patagial. So that's a key mark for red-tailed hawk. Number 3 is the belly band. People are pretty familiar with that. Now, there are other markings underneath on red-tailed hawks, some more than others. On this bird I've shown as the main feature here, got a very nicely marked belly band cutting across. It's those streaks coming from the sides, flanks of the birds across the belly. So that's a key mark for red-tailed hawk. Number 4, the pale backpack V. Okay, so red-tailed hawks have pale scapulars. The scapulars are the feathers at the shoulder area. So when the bird is flying, they're the ones that are just proximal from the inside part of the wing. And when the bird is perched, and we'll see this on some other individuals, they're the shoulder area on the side, and they come together to kind of form a little V here. So that's the backpack V, like the bird's got a backpack on and it gives a V shape. All right, so there you go. Number 5 is the dark hangman's hood, and we don't want to give a bad rap to the red-tailed hawk with that term, but they do decidedly have a dark-looking head on many individuals. All right, so let's stick with our 5 key marks. The tail is orange tail on adults. Notice the bird in the middle showing a very pale aspect to that orange tail as the light is reflecting off of it. So on the underside of the tail, you got to be cautious with your assessment of tail color. As the bird curves around, you're going to get different angles of the light, and you're going to get that orange color you want. So watch out for very brief views or birds that get away. Consider your impressions. All right, number 2, dark patagials are obvious on the leading edge of the wing. This individual in the center has some end off on the far left, and the one on the far right. They all have very prominent dark bars there, and you can see that very easily when you glance at the bird in flight. Okay, you don't see them, of course, when the wings are closed, but when they're flying, that's a mark you can see very easily, and even at a great distance if you learn how to look for it. Our third mark here, a belly band of dark marks across the belly. Now, notice that it varies on these individuals in the photos. First off, in this brightly lit bird with a little aspect angle at the middle here, the belly band is kind of washed out looking and doesn't show a whole lot. Over here, the one on the right, it looks like it's generally not that heavily marked. The one on the far left has a more strongly marked belly band. So that can vary, but there's going to be on our typical individuals a noticeable band there of dark markings. Where'd my, there we go. So the hangman's hood is that dark hood. You can certainly see it very well on the right-hand bird, or look at the left-hand flying bird, that very dark hooded look together with those dark patagials. The right-hand flying bird, also that nice dark hooded look. But notice there's a white chin. It looks kind of clean on this bird on the lower right. If you look carefully at some of these birds in flight, you'll notice that there's actually on a lot of individuals kind of some dark streaks and some white there that forms a pale area, but it's often not a strongly contrasting pale area, but there's a paleness there that kind of breaks up that hood as you look carefully on that part of the bird. And our last mark of the key marks is the pale backpack V on the scapulars. We still don't see a perched bird, so we'll go ahead and keep watching for that on a perched bird. So I was mentioning that we're looking at western red-tailed hawks, and this is a good slide to point out that they often have a kind of creamy tone on their underparts. You can see it real well, I think, on the center bird, and all of these are not white, but there's a creamy tone, and some it's a lot more pronounced and warmer than others. But there's mostly, if you get a nice look, you'll be able to see that it's not a whiteness there, but there's a little another sort of a tone, particularly on the breast area, is where you're going to be seeing a lot of that color when it's around. All right, so sticking with the theme, we can look at these pictures and apply our 5 marks. Let's just kind of see what we notice on all of these pictures. First, we can see one thing I didn't mention on this left-hand top picture, that the adult red-tailed hawk has a nice dark trailing edge. This is a feature on adults, and it's kind of a useful ID feature in some cases with some other species, but we'll see that there. And we can see these feathers are kind of worn. These primaries have little notches in them. And indeed, there seems to be something going on. The wing doesn't have a very smooth line here, and there's some growing new primary here. So this bird is molting, and it's got some evidence of wear in its feathers we can see there. If we go to the center flying bird, we can again notice our tail pattern. And notice that the red-tailed hawk has some marks here at what we could call carpal marks, a little like a comma on the wing. A lot of bootios may have that kind of mark, either more bold or less bold. It's not an ID feature for the red-tail, but it's something we see on bootios. And now we can see our backpack V really well on the perched bird. We can even see the scapular tract right here standing out with a different contour down here from the other feathers, and they're mostly whitish, forming this kind of V shape. So there's our backpack V. Notice these adult red-tailed hawks have dark eyes. This is a feature of a red-tailed. If you see it in a good light, it almost looks reddish brown. It could be just brown, but they have a dark eye. It's variable. Older birds get darker eyes, and it's not a full adult aspect red-tail, generally speaking, until it has a dark eye. We'll talk a little more about that. So lots of fun details to notice. I can notice that also some of these birds show a little more face pattern than others, like the pair down below on the left kind of shows a little bit of an eyebrow effect, and this lone bird facing away on the middle right has that kind of eyebrow effect too. So that's something you commonly see on adult red-tailed hawks, but it kind of varies from bird to bird. Some show more than others. Notice too at the center bird, these two flying around, how at a different light angle, the underwing can appear very different. It can appear very bright, or it could appear more dim. So you want to consider that again with short views, or as you're watching the bird. And also notice on the red-tailed hawk that the underwing of the flight feathers is basically pale, the underside of the flight feathers rather. So our flight feathers are the primaries. I'm looking at the top center bird. Secondaries are the ones we're concerned about. And it's pretty much whitish under here. There's some barring and things, but ignore that. And you can see it is a white, generally a pale underwing without a lot of underwing contrast. We'll remember that for later. All right, so a lot of times, actually, you get a good look, and it's pretty easy wood, but sometimes the birds are far away or partly obscured. But right away, you say it's probably a red tail. and you're good to go, right? But actually, you know, what you want to do when you have a bird that is not giving you the best views for whatever reason is you're really applying the same marks. So a bird that's perched in the distance is often facing toward you is going to show very white aspect underneath. If you have your scope or it's not too far away, you're going to pick out that dark head. You can see this bird on the upper right on the tree up above the rock is showing that nice dark hangman's hood. And I can even see a little bit of dark of a belly band there on the sides, even though it's mostly obscure at this distance. So right away, it's probably a red tail. And indeed, you know what this bird's probably doing is it's probably a male perched in his territory, and he perches up in a visible spot so his neighbors could see him. And he's saying, "This is my spot, and I'm surveying my realm." So long story short, though, for faraway birds, apply those same 5 basic marks to get you there. And keep in mind that dark hangman's hood is a good long distance clue. All right, so now adult red tails look one way, but juvenile red tails look a different way, and birds in their second year look mostly like adults, but not quite. So let's unfold that a little bit. We have a nest showing in the image here on the lower left. We've got an adult red-tailed hawk standing looking over her shoulder, probably hers, and glaring at us with her red eye. And here we've got a nestling. It's not in full juvenile plumage yet, but it's begun molting some down, a lot of its down out. It has some of its juvenile feathers here on the wing, but it's got a little ways to go. You can see the brown wing of this other nestling in the back. But when they leave the nest, they're going to be in a juvenile plumage. And here's a bird in this fresh juvenile plumage. You can tell it's brand new out of the nest because it doesn't quite proportionally look right. Its head looks a little bit small, and the facial markings there are still developing just a little bit. So he's fresh out, or she, with a little bit of color even there on the breast that's going to wear off to a white. So when red-tailed hawks leave the nest, they are mostly retaining that juvenile plumage for their whole first fall, winter, and into spring. They actually, red-tailed hawks have a preformative molt and a formative plumage, but most individuals don't have it. They don't molt. And so it's kind of silly, but basically, as a birder, what we want to know is the juveniles look like juveniles and all fall, winter, into spring. They're going to start to molt again when we get into spring in April, March and April. They're going to begin their first pre-basic molt and get their first basic plumage. And then they're going to be a 2-year-old red tail, and they're going to look a lot like adults, but they're still going to have a pale eye, and their tail might not be fully developed in its orange pattern with not as much barring. And it's going to take them 3 years to acquire a full-on adult appearance or adult aspect. All right, so we have those 3 different ages, but the second year and the third year red tails look very similar. So let's look at these juveniles we have on the page here. And we can first off say that we don't want to use size or shape really to distinguish a young red tail from another species, because the young red tails look basically like the adult red tails in size and shape. There's some subtle differences, but it's not going to help us get to another species. And they mostly show the same key ID features. Now, the main one that's missing is the orange tail. So we're going to trade that in for a tail that has a bunch of narrow bands. And it still has that prominent white terminal band there at the tip. And this bird in the center is showing that real well with this backlighting. It's something you see often this time of year. Fresh juveniles show it really strongly. It even reminds us of a Cooper's hawk kind of pattern when we see that nice prominent white band there. Now, those feather tips are going to wear away over the months, and it's going to lose that effect. So new feathers are fresh when they start, but they wear away. Juvenile red tails have a more pronounced face pattern than the adults. They often will have a supercilium if you get a decent view. Sometimes it's a little more obscure, but that pale line over the eye or the eyebrow. And they have a pale yellow eye. So it's very kind of whitish yellow on first year birds, and then second year birds, a little richer yellow, trending towards that reddish and darker brown as birds get older. And notice that these young red-tailed hawks are more strongly marked below than the red tails that we had than the adults. and there's a little bit whiter, and there's a prominent pale window that you can see on the upper side of the wing. And sometimes when the lighting's good, it even shows on the underside. So we'll look at this bird kind of center bottom here, and you can see these pale windows. So the inner 5 primaries contrast with the secondaries to create that pale window. And you can see those same ones here on this mostly closed wing. Here's those pale inner primaries. So that's a good sign of a juvenile buteo. Most of them show this, and certainly for red-tailed hawk as well as those pale windows in flight. Now here we have our adult. Should have put that earlier for some comparison. We can see again that pale trailing border is prominent on the adult and much less so, and not really there in the same way on the juvenile bird. Let's take a quick look at a couple other juveniles. Here's one that's just caught a vole. And one thing we can notice is the markings on the underside of the wing are more spread around and kind of more varied on that underside than on an adult, where they're more orderly. And we can also notice that we have these nice long feathers that are hanging down, kind of covering the legs. We call those leggings sometimes. And they have these nice bars, but they don't really contrast with the rest of the bird. Again, here you can see that pale window in the primaries. These are the primaries shifting in the wing differently than the secondaries here as the bird is folding or unfolding its wing. Here's one that's kind of interesting, because this picture was taken in April up in Jackson County. And this is a bird now that's been wearing these feathers ever since the prior July, let's say June, July, when it fledged. And so this is a bird that is maybe 3/4 of a year old, and we can see that it's molting its primaries. So it's missing 3 inner primaries. Actually, it has 10 primaries. You can count 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4. No, I got that right. Anyway, there's 2 or 3 missing there. I can't count and do the show at the same time. But that's kind of interesting. And if you look carefully, you'll see the feathers are worn. So there's some evidence of what's going on later in that young bird's first year of life. And we do see a lot of evidence of molt in these hawks when we're watching, especially during the spring and summertime. It's their main molting period, when you're going to see missing flight feathers, missing tail feathers, missing wing feathers, things like that. So on top of the age differences, we have subspecies. So red tails have a number of different geographic subspecies distributed across the species range, which is not just here in the United States, but several of these subspecies occur in Colorado. Only a few are prominent members of our avifauna, though. Let's see what I have here. So we're talking about subspecies, and sometimes we hear the word form and the word type as well, kind of in the same mix. And we might say it's a Western type, and that's just kind of shorthand for saying it's a Western subspecies, maybe. Sometimes we'll use the word form interchangeably with subspecies, Western subspecies, Western form. It can work both ways. Sometimes a form can be kind of a grouping of subspecies. Notice in the blue here in the box on the left, I've got Calurus and Alicensis with a dash, and that would be like a form. It's a combo of 2 different red-tailed hawk subspecies that we encounter in eBird when we go to enter our local Western type red tails according to their proper type. Should we be doing that, we would be presented with that option, even though our local form is Calurus is the subspecies. That's our Western red tail, but its range bumps up with this one along the British Columbian into Alaska coast, and the 2 are very, very similar, and I think it's presented to us that way in eBird. All right, so when you see that in there, that's what that means, but you choose that one if you want to represent our typical birds in the Front Range metro region. So out on the prairie area, we have another form, which is the eastern red-tailed hawk. And if you want to see them, you kind of want to get away from town and get out there in the prairie proper, but some do come in pretty close to town. And they have a pale throat and are generally more lightly marked underneath. Otherwise, they look quite a lot like the Western, but they're whiter underneath and with a white throat, sometimes decidedly so, and a paler markings like on the belly band. I don't know what our next thing here. So I'm gonna before I go back to that, I'm gonna continue with our Harlan's hawk. This is one that is kind of important to be familiar with because it does look rather different, and we see these during the late fall and wintertime into March or so. And the Harlan's hawk is a far northwestern breeder in Alaska and into western Canada. And it's a dark hawk that comes down to us at that time. Now, some would say it's not even a valid subspecies of the red-tailed hawk, but I'm treating it that way. But the next one also is the Crider's hawk is often thought not to be a valid species. This is a white form we see on the prairie. It's rare here. I'm not going to deal with that more. And this last one, you'll have a hard time finding out a lot about this one reading about red-tailed hawk subspecies, but this is maybe a more heavily marked northern form that we sometimes see here in Colorado. Often looks fairly creamy underneath and very strongly marked with dark markings underneath. Generally kind of rare. So here's how some of those different subspecies play out on the map in their breeding range. And we can see the Harlan's hawk form way up here in the northwestern part of the species range. Okay. On the Harlan's hawk, which would be fun if it was a full species like it was for a while after it was initially described, we could have the 4-letter code ha. That would be kind of good. But the Harlan's is a blackish hawk. The ones that we see almost across the board are the so-called dark morph of the Harlan's hawk. And it's blackish. There's no brown tones. It doesn't have any rufous or brown colors. It's black, but it has white. So black and white, pale contrasting underwings with the dark underwing coverts. Nice white somewhere around the breast area, sometimes a lot, sometimes not so much, and usually some white around the eye. The tail is not orange, but it's pale, trending to darker gray towards the tip. It's kind of a pale-based tail. So it looks pretty different. And we tend to see the Harlan's hawks like along, generally associated with major drainages and things like that. Okay, now we got color morphs. Now these aren't subspecies, but these are different color types within many of the different subspecies of the red tail. And some, like the Crider's hawk, may just be like a white morph of the red tail, for example, and not a separate subspecies. But in a lot of cases, bootios have a light and a dark color morph and something in between, an intermediate morph. And these aren't things that change over time. So we don't call them phases because the bird stays with this. So it doesn't start out light and become dark like my son had blonde hair and it became dark. But no, it stays the same all along. And often one morph is much more common. In the case of the red-tailed hawk, it is the, for our western red-tailed hawk and the eastern and so on, it is the light morph that is more common. And the individuals of these morphs, they freely interbreed together, and offspring can look different, one or the other type, and so on. So as we look at some of these images, we go from the typical light morph in the lower left and kind of work to a more black morph type extreme on the upper right. And often there's a lot of intergradation between them, and so it's not too good to worry too much about trying to be sure intermediate morph, dark morph. You can just understand this is how red tails are. And some of these, like the slower left-hand birds, are probably light morph birds that are just at a dark extreme of markings. So there is this variety that goes on with these color morphs. Still can go with the orange tail, the dark patagials in a lot of cases, and the belly band in some cases. Now, when the birds get dark, it's kind of hard to go with a lot of those features, right? But you can fall back on a habitat clue. Look at this dark bird sitting here on a light standard. Now, what self-respecting ferruginous hawk or rough-leg hawk would ever sit up on a light standard like that over? No way. It's got to be a red-tailed hawk. So there you go. So we do have these other buteo species. Colorado has 7 buteos. 5 of them are regular. 2 of them are rare, the zone-tailed hawk and the red-shouldered hawk are both rare in Colorado, but we have 4 others in addition to the red-tail that do occur regularly. And we'll just take a little look at each of these very briefly. Now, I will say on my November bird bombs is going to be called prairie raptors, and I'm going to be dealing with all of these other hawks, plus some of the other raptors out on the prairie. So this is just a little tidbit, and our red-tail is forming a background for that. So on the left, we have our smallest of our buteos, the broad-winged hawk, which is migrating through right now. They have this boldly banded tail. Sometimes you only see maybe one band here, or it only kind of shows a little more simply than on this particular view with a very widespread tail. And they're kind of barred underneath in reddish. So I'm showing adults here. So that's the broad-winged hawk. And it is our smallest one with the shortest wings. And it's a forest hawk. So those shorter wings are actually helping it out, and it's maneuvering through that generally more wooded environment. The Swainson's hawk is the only other one, along with the red tail, that actually gets common in Colorado. The others are all we would term generally uncommon. Sometimes the rough-leg can be pretty numerous, and it's a good spot in a good winter. But generally, the Swainson's can be quite numerous, breeding and as a migrant. And notice it has a two-tone underwing. Most of the ones we see are the light morph like this bird showing. Two-tone underwing with a dark hood with a bib effect. We have this broad white throat that creates a brown contrasting bib on the breast. Swainson's hawk. The ferruginous hawk is often a paler hawk. Again, the light morph is the common one. Notice it has some dark around the patagial area, but it's more diffuse and it doesn't form a particular dark bar. And the tail is not orange. Sometimes it can look orangish. The ferruginous hawk is light-headed. It doesn't have a hangman's hood. It has a prominent yellow seal there, and it's kind of reddish above. The most striking often is the rough-legged hawk. They have these broad, bold, dark carpal patches, and out on the wings, they don't have any dark on the patagials, and many individuals have a big, broad band across the belly, a little different from our red tail, and a different tail pattern. So we can see a lot of similarities and some differences. Didn't mention things like flight profiles, an important distinction there. Red tail holds its wings basically horizontal. The Swainson's has a slight dihedral, or the wings angled up a little bit. There are a lot of differences. We'll get into some of that in a later bird bombs. One thing that's kind of cool with the ferruginous hawk is you have these 3 points of light when you see the upper part of the bird, very different from the upper side of the red tail adult. So white, white, and white. We call that 3 points of light on the beautiful ferruginous hawk. So as we think about these other species, we can see that two of them are much less common than the others. This is a graph of frequency, a percent of checklists where the species is reported, which tracks well with numbers for these birds. And we see the red tail much more frequent, a little less frequent in the breeding season than the non-breeding season, but very frequent then. In the Swainson's, present only during the breeding season, arriving in April, departing over these weeks right now. Say goodbye to the Swainson's. Ferruginous is actually present through the nesting season, but in rather low numbers. The rough leg goes away far north during the nesting season, doesn't come back until October. So you can kind of get a relative sense. The red tail is the only one we have. Well, that's not true. The red tail and the Swainson commonly nest in the metro area and along the Front Range. We can see on the map from the Breeding Bird Atlas here that the red tail is well distributed across Colorado, with all those dark squares showing areas where nesting was confirmed. Okay, so a few different bootios, but then we see other kinds of raptors that are not bootios. We'll look briefly here, and we can just kind of focus on differences. Eagles, much bigger with their broad, longer wings. And the harriers have a different shaped head, kind of flat faced with their little bit of the facial disc going on. They have long wings and a long tail. That's a unique combo here. The bootios have long wings and a short tail, relatively speaking. The accipiters have, oops, I'm not even doing this the way I planned it, so I'm just going to go ahead and click all these. The accipiters have shorter wings relatively and a longer tail for maneuvering through the woods. Short tail, long wings for the fast-flying falcon. So we won't spend any more time on these, but we can see we do encounter other raptors, and we're using the red tail often as a gauge to get to a harrier, for example, or something like that. So remember, we want to ask ourselves, why isn't it a red tail? So now we've taken a lot of the basics in on red tail. So let's see what you know. It's probably a red tail. Have a look. Okay. What do you think? Not. All right, but why not? Well, first we can see it's got a pale head, so no dark hangman's hood. Doesn't really have a belly band. There's some markings there, but we won't call that a belly band. It's got that reddish up on the shoulders, and even these reddish leggings that are contrasting also are different from red-tailed hawk. But what is it? Yeah, ferruginous hawk. All right. Here's another. It's probably a red tail. Take a little close up. Actually, this one looks a little different now that I look at a little closer with my red tail framework. Not. Why not? Okay, again, a pale head. So no hangman's hood. No, it's got pale patagials, not dark patagials, and it has these big dark patches out on the wrist area here, carpal patches, big dark belly patch, and a different tail color. So what do you think? It's not a red tail, that's for certain. The rough leg hawk. And I know you got my pattern here, but don't be too self-assured. It's probably a red tail. Not, and why not? All right, so one thing that stands out right away, you've got a two-tone wing with the flight feathers being dark. It's got no dark patagials. There's no belly band. It's got some markings, but it's not a belly band. It has a big, heavy dark brown bib with a white throat there, right? Contrasting white throat. It doesn't have the red tail pattern, not even quite like the juvenile, actually. So what is it? It's our good summertime friend, the Swainson's hawk. It's probably a red tail. I think that was actually said about a bird of this species just the other day. Somebody sent me a picture and they were wondering. Not, why not? Well, no belly band. It's got this bold banded tail of big white and dark bands. It doesn't have a dark hood, no dark patagial. See how simple it is? You look up with your red tail filter, it's not a red tail. All right, so what is it? Yeah, it's our broad-winged hawk. It's one that's kind of a treat to see during fall migration. They're not common. They're not all adults like this one. They can be immature bird juveniles that are going to look a little different, keep you on your toes. But you can use your red tail key marks to figure out why it's not a red tail. All right, so I want to say thank you very much to the many photographers whose images I was able to use for this presentation. I'm very grateful. Images are credited, I hope, on each slide. Thank you for sharing and making Bird Bombs possible. If you want to be a Bird Bombs photo contributor, just let me know. If you put images on eBird, I can easily see what you have and consider using them. So check out the past bird bombs on our video archive page at dfobirds.org. Go to the programs page and scroll down to the bird bombs button. And this one will be up hopefully in a day or two, and you can review it at your own leisure or tell a friend about it, have them look at it. And our next bird bombs is coming up on October 19th, and it's Colorado sea ducks. Wait a minute, Colorado, right in the middle of the continent, and we've got sea ducks. What's going on? Well, indeed, we're going to check out some of the very fun birds of fall that are a treat to see, and you got to go look for them, the scoters. And along with that, we'll talk about the long-tailed duck. So I'm going to stop my screen share here, and I'm going to invite Laura to come on. We'll see if we have any questions or answers, or hopefully some answers too. Questions and comments.
Thanks, David. If you do have questions, please drop them in the Q&A or the chat, and I'll get them either place. First off, Dana says, very nice presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
My first question for you is, we talked a lot about a lot of variation in the red-tailed hawk species, right? We've got the different morphs, the different subspecies, all this sort of variation going on with some key diagnostics. Is there that much variation in other buteos, other raptors, other birds? There's so much sort of like
you just expanded it to 10,000 species,
right?
but
what's going on with red tails?
Well, let's just look at some of the other buteos. We'll just consider that part. And yes, they're all a little bit different. Not all the different species have necessarily a light and an intermediate and a dark morph, but a lot of them do have that variation, and many of them have differences with the young birds looking different than adults, generally not acquiring the same coloration yet is a principal difference, sometimes some pattern differences as well. And so those are just differences you have to learn to deal with. Now, the good thing is that many of the ones we see of other species are of a particular color morph, say, like most of the ferruginous we see are the light morph. And so when we see a dark morph, it makes it tricky because they look a little different and we have to figure out, because there's lots of things that could be mostly all dark. And then those are a little harder IDs. And we didn't go there in depth tonight. And it's a little more nuanced sometimes. But when you learn what the bird does, how it moves, how it holds its wings, the shape of it, those are helpful clues also in those circumstances. But I'm kind of getting beyond your question, but it is complicated for a lot of the different bootios and other raptors as well. We know that eagles have lots of different ages. So what it comes down to is you want to learn well the ones that you can observe a lot, so that will help you to recognize when something's different. Or even with the light western red tail is our basic red tail that we see. So learn that one well. And then when we see something that looks different, maybe a different color morph, we still have some background to judge that is a red tail, even though it's really differently colored. And sometimes they're strikingly so, but you can know by some of those features, as well as the bird shape and what you become familiar with, kind of what that is. And that kind of helps to sort it out.
Cool, awesome. Cindy also says, thanks for the presentation. She enjoyed it. Let's see. Janet says, wonderful presentation. Have you noticed when you're birding in the Denver metro area that Swainson's hawks appear to be increasing and pushing out the nesting red tails? Looks like she's observed that Swainson to red tail ratio is increasing over the summer, the past few years.
So
Like that?
I have not, but what strikes me is that's a really interesting idea, and I would think that I would want to kind of somehow get a lot of information from a lot of different areas. And I feel like for me, it would be hard to see that, but if I put like 50 observers together in different areas and I have like a little bit of information over years, maybe I could source that out. But, that's an interesting question. It kind of would hint maybe if there were some habitat changes that were going on. I don't know what would happen that would favor Swainson's particularly, but there can be other population dynamics that happen, and it does show that things do change, and red tail is a really common hawk for us right now, but on different scales and things, those kind of things can change as well. So I like Swainson's too, so we'll welcome them in.